My name is Rachel Parker. I am 31. 5 years ago, I left my career in San Francisco, an office with glass walls, with a good salary, to return to my small hometown in Iowa and take care of my father, Thomas, after my mother died. My older brother James, the big shot banker in Chicago, and my sister Karen, the admired teacher in Denver, rarely called and almost never visited. All the weight fell on me. At Dad's 75th birthday, in front of neighbors and relatives, James stood up with a smirk and said, "Pack your bags, loser. This house is going on the market." My heart stopped. Dad looked confused, while Karen nodded approvingly. Trembling, I picked up my phone and made a call that would turn the entire night upside down. Before I tell you what happened next, write in the comments where you are watching from. Hit like and subscribe to my channel if your family ever underestimated you. 2 years ago, everything in our quiet routine changed when my father met Linda. He was 73 then, lonely after losing my mom, and I suppose part of me even felt relieved at first that he might find companionship again. Linda worked as a nurse at a nearby clinic. She was 48, blonde with carefully styled hair that never seemed out of place, always wearing just enough perfume to leave a trace in the air after she left a room. She carried herself like someone who had studied how to look kind and trustworthy. Smiles at the right moments, soft tones, gentle pats on the arm. To the neighbors, she seemed like a godsend. "Thomas deserves happiness," they would say when she stopped by with a basket of muffins or fussed over Dad's sweater in front of them. Everyone thought it was sweet. But from the beginning, something about her unsettled me. It wasn't that I didn't want Dad to move on, it was the way she looked around the house when she thought no one was watching. Not at the family photos, not at the furniture, but at the walls, the beams, the land outside the windows. As if she was calculating something. The house had history. It wasn't just a building, it had belonged to my mother's family for generations. My grandparents built it, my mom grew up there, and when she married Dad, she insisted they keep it. Every floorboard told a story. Every dent in the woodwork came from decades of living. It wasn't the kind of place you bought, it was the kind of place that was passed down, protected, loved. And that was exactly why Linda's attention to it made me nervous. At first, her comments were small, easy to dismiss. "Such a big place for just the two of you," she would say lightly, glancing around. Or, "The market must be good for farmhouses like this these days." Dad never caught the undertone, but I did. I had learned to listen between the lines. Then came the questions, always framed as accidents. One afternoon while I was organizing Dad's medications, she leaned casually against the counter and asked, "So, Rachel, do you know if your dad ever updated his will after your mom passed?" These old farmhouses can be complicated legally. I remember how my hands froze on the pillbox. I looked at her, trying to read whether she had realized how transparent the question was. She smiled innocently, stirring sugar into her tea, as if she had just asked about the weather. Another time, she walked with me out to the garden, pretending to admire the roses my mother had planted years ago. "It's a lot of work maintaining all this land," she said. "If something ever happened, do you think you could handle it on your own? Or would you sell?" I wanted to snap at her, but I bit my tongue. She wasn't asking out of concern for me. She was probing, measuring what stood between her and the property. What unsettled me even more was how quickly she connected with James. My brother barely called Dad before Linda entered the picture, but suddenly they were meeting for coffee. At first, I thought maybe it was genuine. James was in finance. Maybe she wanted advice about her retirement or savings. But then I overheard her once, standing just outside the porch door, speaking in a lowered voice. "I'm only worried about his health," she told him. "I just think decisions should be made sooner rather than later." Decisions. That word clung to me like a bad taste. When I asked James about it later, he brushed me off. "Relax, Rachel. She's just concerned. Dad isn't getting any younger." His tone was dismissive, condescending, the way he always spoke to me when he wanted to remind me of my place as the less successful sibling. But there was something smug in his smile that told me he was enjoying the alliance. Karen, on the other hand, stayed mostly out of it. She called every few weeks, usually when she needed something. She never said much about Linda, except for one awkward remark during a holiday visit. Well, at least Dad isn't alone anymore. You should be happy for him. But she wasn't the one who saw the subtle shifts, the way Linda began to insert herself into daily life. Linda had a way of making her presence permanent. She left clothes in Dad's closet after only a month of dating. Her toothbrush appeared in the bathroom. She started answering the phone when relatives called, and sometimes I'd hear her retelling conversations later to James with small twists that made me look irresponsible. Rachel forgot to refill the prescription again, she once said within earshot, though I hadn't forgotten. I confronted her about it later, but she just laughed and said, "Oh, you know how people mishear things." It wasn't just what she said, it was how she positioned herself. She became the filter, the interpreter of Dad's needs, even though I was the one cooking, cleaning, scheduling appointments, and staying up through his bad nights. And the worst part? Dad seemed grateful. He liked the attention, the flattery, the way she touched his hand at dinner. He didn't notice the way she tightened her grip on his shoulder when I disagreed with her. He didn't see how her eyes flicked toward James every time money or property came up in conversation. The tension grew heavier, but I kept my suspicions to myself. People already thought I was bitter, too protective, maybe jealous of Dad finding someone new. But I wasn't jealous. I was afraid. Afraid that Linda wasn't here for him at all. After my mother's death, the house had become more than just walls and a roof. It was Dad's safe place, my responsibility, and the only link I still had to her. I devoted myself to both the man who raised me and the home she built. Every morning started with a routine I knew by heart, measuring out his medications, making sure his blood pressure pills were taken with breakfast, his arthritis tablets with lunch, and his sleep aids tucked into his nightstand before bed. I tracked every refill on a notepad by the phone. If a doctor changed even a single dosage, I adjusted everything immediately. Then came the walks. Dad loved the open air, though his legs tired quickly. So I bundled him in his old flannel jacket, looped my arm through his, and we shuffled slowly along the gravel driveway. He always paused at the edge of the field, staring out at the cornstalks as if he were trying to see my mother's face in them. She loved this view, he'd say every time. And I would smile and agree, even though it hurt. Meals were sacred. I pulled out Mom's old recipe cards, yellowed at the edges, some smudged with flour from years of use. Chicken pot pie on Tuesdays, beef stew on Thursdays, and apple pie on Sundays. Cooking her meals wasn't just about feeding Dad, it was about reminding him, and myself, that she was still here in some way. Sometimes he'd take a bite, close his eyes, and whisper, "Just like your mother's." Those moments made the exhaustion worth it. But while I poured myself into caring for him and maintaining the farmhouse, my relationship with James and Karen grew colder by the week. They weren't here for the daily struggles, but their opinions never seemed to stop. James, especially, had a knack for cutting me down. He'd call on his lunch break from his glossy Chicago office and lecture me as if I were a teenager. "You're hiding behind Dad because you have no life, Rachel," he'd say, his voice dripping with disdain. "Normal people your age are building careers, starting families, living. You're, what? Playing nurse in some old farmhouse." I wanted to scream at him. I wanted to tell him that his fancy suits and his city skyline apartment didn't make him a better child, that love wasn't measured in promotions or paychecks. But instead, I swallowed my words and hung up, shaking. Karen wasn't as sharp, but her words cut just as deep. She liked to cloak her criticism in concern. "Dad wouldn't want you to sacrifice yourself," she'd sigh when she called from Denver. "He'd want you to live your own life." Yet whenever I suggested she come for a weekend, take a shift at the doctor's office, or even just handle a grocery run when she visited, she always had excuses. "The school year just started," she'd say. Or, "The kids have soccer." Always something. It was a cruel irony. They condemned me for giving too much of myself, yet they never offered to give anything at all. Sometimes they criticized my choices so much I started questioning myself. When Dad's arthritis flared up, I suggested switching to a different specialist in Des Moines. James scoffed. "You think you know better than the doctors?" When Dad's appetite waned, I cooked lighter meals, soups, porridge, soft vegetables. Karen scolded me. He needs protein, Rachel. You're not feeding him enough. But when I asked her what she'd suggest, she didn't answer. It was like being trapped in a game where the rules changed constantly, and I was always the one losing. The loneliness didn't help. Friends from my old life in San Francisco slowly faded away. At first, they called, asked how I was settling in. Then, as months turned into years, their lives moved forward without me. Promotions, engagements, vacations, all things I saw only through social media. Meanwhile, my world shrank to pill bottles, doctor visits, and the endless creak of the farmhouse floorboards. There were nights when I sat alone at the kitchen table after Dad had gone to bed, staring at my mother's recipe cards spread out in front of me, and wondered if James and Karen were right. Had I wasted my life? Was I hiding behind my father instead of facing the world? The thought ate at me, especially when Karen's voice echoed in my head, "Dad wouldn't want you to sacrifice yourself." But then I'd think about Dad sitting in that living room alone, struggling to open a bottle, forgetting which pill to take. I'd think about the farmhouse, my mother's roses still blooming in the garden, her handwriting still etched into the recipe cards, and I knew I couldn't leave. Not yet. The worst moments came when James and Karen visited. James would arrive in his polished car, Karen with her polite smile, and both would spend their time pointing out everything I did wrong. "This place smells musty," James would say, wrinkling his nose. "You should hire someone to clean properly." Karen would sigh, "Dad looks thinner. Are you sure you're managing his diet correctly?" They'd stay for a few hours, take a few photos for social media, and then leave with pats on Dad's shoulder and promises to call more often. Afterward, I'd find myself cleaning for hours, scrubbing floors and polishing furniture as if their judgment had left stains I couldn't wash away. But no matter how much they criticized, the truth was simple: they weren't here. They weren't the ones catching Dad when he stumbled, or sitting in the emergency room at 2 a.m., or waking up in the middle of the night to check if he was breathing. That was me. Always me. And while they had the luxury of criticizing from afar, I carried the burden in silence. Dad's 75th birthday was approaching, and I wanted to make it special. Not just for him, but for myself too. I wanted to prove to James, Karen, to Linda, and maybe even to me, that the years I had spent here hadn't been wasted. That I could give Dad a celebration worthy of his life and of Mom's memory. I started with a photo album. In the attic, under stacks of old quilts and boxes of Christmas decorations, I found the thick leather-bound album my mother used to keep. The pages were brittle, the corners of photographs curling, but as I flipped through them, I felt like I was traveling back in time. Dad in his army uniform, grinning like he owned the world. Mom in her wedding dress, holding a bouquet of wildflowers. James as a toddler, sitting proudly on Dad's shoulders. Karen as a newborn wrapped in my mother's arms. And me, always trailing just behind them, my hair tangled, my smile wide. Some of the photos had water damage, others had faded, but I spent days carefully restoring them. I laid them out on the dining room table, cleaning the glass frames, scanning the worst ones into my laptop, adjusting the colors and reprinting them. At night, after Dad went to bed, I sat with scissors and glue, arranging pages the way Mom used to. I wanted him to see his life laid out in front of him again, to remember not just the hard years, but the love, the laughter, the milestones. Next came the food. Dad's favorite dish had always been turkey, not the kind you rush together for Thanksgiving, but the kind Mom made with patience and pride. She had a secret blend of herbs, the kind you couldn't buy in a store. She used to keep the recipe scribbled on the back of an old envelope tucked in her recipe tin. I still had it, the ink faded, but legible enough for me to follow. I made a practice run a week before the party, filling the house with the smell of roasting turkey, thyme, and garlic. Dad wandered into the kitchen, his eyes misting when he tasted it. That alone made the hours of work worth it. But I didn't stop there. For drinks, I wanted something symbolic, something that carried meaning. I remembered how, on every anniversary, Mom and Dad would open a bottle of a particular red wine. It wasn't expensive, but it was rare, from a small vineyard in California where they had gone on their honeymoon. After she died, the last bottle they had saved was never touched. Dad kept it on the top shelf of the cabinet, as if opening it would mean admitting she was gone for good. I spent days calling wine shops, scouring online auctions, even contacting the vineyard itself. Most places laughed when I asked. But then, by some miracle, I found a collector in Minnesota who had 2 bottles left. They weren't cheap, but I didn't care. I ordered one, had it shipped overnight, and when it arrived, I placed it carefully in the cabinet beside the dusty original. This time, I promised myself Dad would drink it. Not in mourning, but in celebration of the love he and Mom had shared. Still, I felt something was missing. A party wasn't just food and photos. It needed music. And then I remembered at my parents' wedding, there had been a violinist. For years afterward, whenever Mom told the story of their wedding, she always mentioned the music. He played our song, she would say, and it felt like the world stopped. I had no idea if the man was still alive, let alone still playing, but I started searching anyway. I tracked down the old wedding program in a box of my mother's things. The name scribbled there was Daniel Murphy, a violinist from Des Moines. I spent hours on the phone, following leads, calling music schools and retirement homes. Finally, I found him, or rather, his daughter. Mr. Murphy was 82 now, she said, but he still played. Not professionally anymore, but for friends, for church, and sometimes for weddings of family friends. When I told her why I was calling, there was a long pause. Then she said softly, he'd be honored. When I hung up, I felt something I hadn't in years, excitement. For once, it wasn't about caretaking or responsibility. It was about creating joy. The days leading up to the party were a blur of preparations. I polished the old dining table until it gleamed, scrubbed the kitchen floors, and borrowed extra chairs from the neighbors. I ironed tablecloths, bought fresh flowers, and set the table with Mom's wedding china that had been locked away in the cabinet since she passed. Every detail mattered. Even the invitations, I didn't want it to feel like a casual gathering. I handwrote each one on thick cardstock, inviting not just family but Dad's old friends, our closest neighbors, even a few of his former coworkers who still lived nearby. I wanted the house to be full of voices, laughter, and life. At night, when the house was quiet, I sat on the porch swing, exhausted but satisfied. I pictured Dad's face when he saw the photo album, when he tasted the turkey, when he sipped the wine and heard the violin. I wanted him to feel, just for one evening, like he was surrounded by love, not by loss. And maybe, secretly, I wanted James and Karen to see too. To see that while they criticized, while they stayed distant, I was the one keeping our family together. I was the one who still remembered what mattered. By the time the morning of the party arrived, the house sparkled, the food was prepped, the wine rested on the counter, and the photo album sat proudly on the coffee table. I had done everything I could. For once, I felt ready, not just to celebrate my father, but to face whatever my siblings had to say. The evening unfolded the way I had dreamed it would. By 6, the porch lights glowed warm against the summer dusk, and the kitchen was alive with the good chaos of neighbors balancing casserole lids and old friends taking off their shoes at the door. Mrs. Alvarez from down the road arrived with her blackberry cobbler, the Peabody's brought sweet corn, and Mr. Jennings, Dad's fishing buddy, carried in a stack of paper plates because he knew I never remembered them. The living room smelled like roasted turkey and thyme, like Sundays from 20 years ago. The photo album lay open on the coffee table, and people kept pausing there, fingers hovering over glossy squares of time, laughing softly when they recognized their younger selves. Dad shaved for the occasion. He wore his wedding ring and the blue cardigan my mother always said made his eyes look kind. When he stepped into the room, the violinist, Daniel Murphy, older and gentler than in the wedding photo, but still steady with the bow, slid into the old song as if he had been waiting for that moment all week. I watched my father's face change, the lines easing, the confusion of recent months thinning just enough for recognition to break through. He reached for my hand and squeezed. "Your mother loved that one," he whispered, and for a second, I felt the presence of her approval like a shawl across my shoulders. Everything was in motion, timed and careful. I kept the turkey warm, slid the rolls under a towel, refreshed the pitcher of lemon water. Neighbors asked where to put gifts. I arranged flowers that kept listing toward the left. People drifted in and out of rooms, and the house absorbed the noise and gave it back as comfort. For once, I wasn't running defense against somebody's criticism. I was hosting. I was the daughter my mother raised me to be. James arrived late, as if a carefully curated delay could double his importance. He wore a navy suit that didn't belong to any farm in Iowa, and a stainless steel watch that flashed every time he lifted his glass. Karen came a few minutes later, hair pinned, smile tidy, cardigan draped just so, holding a store-bought cake she announced cost an arm and a leg. Linda, who had said she might not stay long because of an early shift, glided in on time anyway, perfume pushing ahead of her, her smile already rehearsed. She wore white, which felt like a decision. I tried to keep my distance. I could be polite. I could manage. Turkey smells good, Karen said, sliding a glance at Linda as if seeking an invisible scoreboard. If Dad can chew it. It's soft, I said. You'll see. James gave me a once-over, the kind that always felt like evaluation. Nice turnout, he said. Who's paying? I am, I answered, and he smirked like he'd expected nothing else. We ate in 2 long waves, because our table wasn't big enough. The first wave included Dad and his old friends while I carried plates and refilled water glasses and cut turkey the way Mom taught me, small pieces, crispy skin saved for last. Daniel played low near the doorway, so his music threaded through conversation rather than sat on top of it. My nerves settled. People were happy. Dad chewed slowly and asked for seconds. When I brought them, he patted my wrist. Perfect, he said. I swallowed hard and kept moving. By 8:30, the house had settled into that late evening warmth where everyone is fed and full and the air holds onto laughter. The wine I'd ordered, another piece of the past resurrected, rested on the sideboard, breathing like a secret. I set out the good glasses and felt the knot in my chest loosen. This, I thought, is what we needed. A night that said, we remember who we are. Karen drifted toward the photo album. Linda followed. They stood over it like critics at a gallery, pointing and murmuring. I couldn't hear what they said, but I watched Linda's finger land on the page with the picture of the house in winter, the snow piled up against the porch. Her smile tightened. She was counting again. I clinked a spoon against a glass and asked for everyone's attention so Dad could make a simple toast. He cleared his throat and thanked the neighbors, thanked Mr. Murphy for the music, thanked me for the turkey. His voice wobbled when he said my name, and the room gave a soft chorus of, ah, and I felt my lungs expand for the first time that day. Then James stood. He didn't need a spoon. He tapped his fork against his wine glass with an easy rhythm that told everyone he expected the floor. The chatter fell away like a curtain. He glanced at Linda, who tilted her head, and at Karen, who gave a tiny lift of her chin, and then he turned to the room with a smile that never reached his eyes. Dad made a decision yesterday, he announced, slick and sure, as if nothing that came out of his mouth could possibly be questioned. This house is too big for him. So we're selling it. Rachel, pack your bags, loser. The last word snapped like a trap. It wasn't even whispered. He gave it to the room, gift wrapped in humiliation, and left it on my lap. A laugh spilled out of Linda, bright, high, not entirely sober, and Karen's approving nods arrived right on cue, delicate and precise, like she was agreeing to something ordinary. The sounds in the room rearranged themselves at once. A chair scraped. Someone coughed and pretended it was a joke. Someone else said, oh, in a way that landed like a fall. The violinist lowered his bow and stepped back. I heard the refrigerator motor kick on and off, that tiny domestic click that suddenly seemed too loud. My face burned hot, then cold. I looked at Dad. He stared at James the way people look at words in a language they once knew but can't recall under pressure. Confusion clouded his eyes. He lifted a hand and put it down again. He started and stopped. His gaze flitted to the photo album, the winter picture of the farmhouse, the wine waiting like a memory at the edge of the room. James, I said, and the word tunneled out of me like a breath in winter, visible, fragile. I had not prepared for this moment because I had not allowed myself to believe he would stage it here, in front of Dad's friends, his neighbors, our past. That was my mistake. I had forgotten that humiliation was his favorite instrument. He shrugged, delighted by his own performance. It's practical, Rachel. Responsible. You don't understand how equity works. You've been playing house. He lifted his glass as if to toast the efficiency of it all. Time for adults to make decisions. The room tilted. The walls that had held our birthdays and Christmases and my mother's laughter leaned back, listening to see what I would do. Linda touched James's sleeve with 2 fingers, proprietary and encouraging. Karen kept nodding, small, steady, a metronome of agreement. I felt ridiculous things heat behind my knees, a buzzing in my ears, the urge to smooth the tablecloth, but under all of it, a clarity formed, hard as bone. I could stay and argue. I could flip the table, scream, cry, or demand. The options flashed like cards. But Dad's mouth had gone slack, the way it does when too much is happening around him and the world starts to feel slippery. His fingers worried the edge of a napkin. I set my glass down without drinking. The wine could wait. My mother would have told me to breathe through my nose, to put the fire where it belonged. The night had been built for memory. I was not going to let it be rewritten as my public scolding. Excuse me, I said to no one in particular. I curved around the guests, around Mr. Murphy's soft apology of a bow, around the photo album that was still open to my parents dancing in 1974. I touched the hallway wall as I passed, just to steady myself, and crossed the threshold to the porch. The air outside was cooler, the porch boards still warm from the day. Crickets worked their steady chorus in the grass. I closed the door gently so the latch didn't carry back into the living room, and for a second I let my forehead rest against the wood. The house smelled like old dust and polish. Then I stepped back, slid my phone from my pocket, and dialed a number. 20 minutes later, headlights rolled over the gravel like a white tide, and a car eased to a stop by the maple tree. I was still on the porch, phone clutched in my hand, the house behind me humming with embarrassed small talk and the soft squeak of chairs. The engine cut, a door shut, and Mark Evans stepped into the porch light, same alert eyes as in college, same steady shoulders, only now he wore a navy suit and the posture of someone who walks into hard rooms for a living. Rachel, he said quietly, as if saying my name any louder might break something. You okay? I wasn't, and he could see it. But I nodded, because I had called him and because for the last 2 days I had been building toward this exact moment like laying a fuse. Mark specializes in child abuse cases, kids who get lost in the system, the ones people excuse and overlook. He always hated bullies, even when they wore suits. Over the years, that specialty taught him every emergency tool the law allows when a vulnerable person is being managed, medicated, or pressured for someone else's gain. He knew the shape of harm when it tried to pass for care. That was what I needed tonight. Then another set of headlights swept the yard, a second car pulling in close behind. Uncle Henry climbed out first, Dad's younger brother by 7 years, leaner than my father, and perpetually sunburned from decades fixing tractors and roofs. He wore his good work jacket and a face that didn't bother hiding how tired he was of my brother's theatrics. From the passenger side, a woman unfolded carefully, Dr. Patel, the family physician from town who had known me since I was the kid with skinned knees and band-aids stuck to every elbow. She carried a small black bag instead of a purse. The sight of it loosened a muscle in my chest I hadn't realized I'd been clenching. "Rach," Uncle Henry said, low. "You called." "I came." Dr. Patel gave me the kind of look that holds both concern and instruction. "Is Thomas inside?" "He is," I said. "But there's a crowd." Mark's gaze flicked to the windows glowing behind the curtains, to the silhouettes moving through my father's birthday, like they hadn't just detonated it. "We'll keep it calm," he said. "First, I need to hear everything again, as plainly as you can say it." I took a breath and let the last week play as a sequence of small, precise betrayals. A couple of days ago, I'd opened the medicine cabinet to prep Dad's afternoon pills and found 2 bottles that looked identical to his usual prescriptions, but the labels were fresh, the fonts wrong, the pharmacy different. The pills themselves had a slightly different color, less sheen, and a chalky smell that didn't belong. I know his medications the way I know the creaks in the hallway. This was not a normal refill. When I confronted Linda, she put a hand to her chest and said, "Oh, silly me, I must have grabbed the generic at the clinic. It's the same thing." But her eyes had done that slide to the right that always gave away her lies. I set the bottles aside and, that night, took clear photos of the old labels and the new ones side by side. The next morning, 2 men in polo shirts and crisp smiles had walked the property with clipboards, introduced by Linda as real estate appraisers doing a favor. They measured the porch, peered at the foundation, walked the fence line like they owned the horizon. I watched from the kitchen with the dish towel still in my hands and asked Linda why appraisers were here when we weren't selling. "Just curious what the place is worth," she chirped. "For insurance." I wrote down their names from their business cards as soon as she set them on the counter, then later typed those names into my phone and took screenshots of the listings they were connected to: high-volume flipping, quick closes, cash offers. And then there were the messages. Linda used my father's tablet sometimes to play music for him. She never remembered to log out. I wasn't snooping. I was cleaning the screen when the notification banner lit up with a preview that read, "If we get this done before the end of the month, you'll have your half in time for Chicago." It was from a contact saved as J. There are a lot of JS in the world, but only one who shows up and calls his own sister a loser in the same breath. I forwarded what I could to my email. Screenshots, dates, the thread where Linda asked, "Is the sleeping one strong enough? He was hard to wake last time." My hands shook then. They were steady now. "I've got all of it," I told Mark. Photos. Screenshots. The cards from the appraisers. I put the bottles in a Ziploc with the date. "Smart," he said, and I could hear the relief in his voice at the proof of the thing I was claiming. "You did everything right." Uncle Henry shifted his weight, the boards under us creaking a familiar note. "I knew something smelled wrong," he muttered. "Your dad's been groggy. Falling asleep at the table." Linda kept saying it was just age. Thomas never used to nap in the daylight unless he'd been out bailing since dawn. Dr. Patel rested her bag on the porch rail. "If he's being oversedated," she said, choosing the cleanest word for what we all felt, "we need to evaluate him tonight. Privately. I'll ask basic orientation questions and check vitals. If necessary, we document, and I'll call in an attending to order labs first thing in the morning." Mark looked back at me. "And you're sure you want to do this now? In front of them?" "I don't want to fight," I said. "I want truth in the room." I swallowed. They used my father's birthday to announce a sale he never agreed to. They think I'll shake or fold. But I'm done folding. A door opened behind us and a burst of laughter slipped through, the wrong kind, hard and bright and careless. I slid my thumb over the edge of my phone to keep from breaking it. "Okay," Mark said, switching gears the way I remembered from debate team, organized, relentless kind. "Here's how we do this. Rachel, you and I go in first. Keep your voice steady, say nothing inflammatory, and don't rise to bait. Henry, walk with Dr. Patel straight to Thomas. Stay with them. If anyone tries to interfere, you call out to me. I'll be 2 steps away. We don't present anything tonight. We don't accuse. We observe and document. Tomorrow, if what we suspect is confirmed, I file for an emergency protective order and a temporary injunction against any transfer of property. But for tonight, we are witnesses." The plan settled over me like a clean blanket. It wasn't revenge. It was order. My mother used to say there's a difference between a storm and a system. One breaks, one repairs. Uncle Henry rubbed his palms together, a farmer gearing up for weather. "Let's get my brother." Before we moved, I gave Mark the envelope I'd prepared because some part of me had known the party would turn. Inside were printouts of the screenshots, a list of the appraisers and their offices, dates and times of Linda's coffee meetings with James that I'd noted in the calendar when she bragged about popping into town, and a typed summary of the medication changes with the pharmacy numbers highlighted. I had even written the smell of the pills in case I forgot later how wrong it was. "You did all this?" Mark asked, flipping through quickly. "I know this house," I said. "I know my father. And I know my brother. Dr. Patel squeezed my arm once, a brief pulse of solidarity. Let's go. We opened the door and the noise pressed in, the violin fallen silent, chairs gathered into little islands, Linda's laugh pinging off the ceiling, Karen's careful voice smoothing edges for the neighbors. James's tone turned magnanimous now that he'd dropped his bomb. Eyes flicked toward us, assessing. Mark became instantly invisible in the way only lawyers can present, but not for them, while Uncle Henry merged into the wallpaper like he'd grown there. Dr. Patel had already slipped down the hall, her steps quiet and purposeful toward my father's room. Linda clocked Mark and then me, her smile sharpening, curiosity pricking at the edges. "Who's this?" "A friend," I said. "And an extra set of hands." James lifted his glass, as if toasting the audacity of guests arriving late to a party he thought he controlled. "We were just discussing logistics," he announced, making sure the word carried, like logistics could excuse everything. "Then you won't mind a little reality check," Uncle Henry said from the hallway, not loud, not threatening, just a man stating the terms of his own property. "Thomas is going to rest in his room with his doctor for a bit. No more announcements tonight." A hush ran through the guests, the kind that happens when a room realizes there's a second script in play. Linda opened her mouth. Mark shifted slightly, not toward her, but toward the center of the room, as if bodies have gravity and he knew exactly where to stand so the truth wouldn't slide off the table. I had suspected James and Linda were up to something, and I had been right. When I stepped back into the dining room with Mark and Uncle Henry at my shoulders, the party had reorganized itself around James. He stood at the head of the table like a salesman at a trade show, glossy folder open, stacks of paper fanned out between the platters of half-eaten turkey and the wilting flowers. He had even uncapped a pen, pressing it theatrically against the top page as if he were doing Dad a favor by making the signature line easy to find. "Timing is everything," he said to the room without looking at me. "If we get this signed tonight, we can lock a great offer before the market moves." On the sideboard, the bottle of anniversary wine that I'd hunted down sat unopened, its foil neck glinting at me like the last piece of a life I was trying to protect. Linda hovered at James's elbow, hand on the chair back, eyes bright. Karen stood a step behind them, her polite smile tightened into something I didn't recognize. Mark didn't announce himself. He stepped forward, calm and efficient, and slid his leather portfolio onto the table beside James's stack. Uncle Henry took the chair nearest Dad and angled his body like a gate. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. The room felt like the second before a storm hits the field and the corn stops moving. James cleared his throat. "Rachel," he said, finally granting me the courtesy of a glance, "we're being practical. Dad's ready. He told me yesterday." Dad looked from James to me, lost in the current. He pressed the napkin to his knee like it was a handle he could hold onto. My pulse pounded, but my voice came out steady. "No one is signing anything tonight." James laughed, a short, dismissive burst. "You don't get to decide that." "Actually," Mark said, his tone flat as a level, "she does." Heads turned. You could hear the air move. Mark opened his portfolio and took out a thin stack of documents clipped together, the top sheet stamped and tabbed. He laid it gently on the tablecloth, squarely on the place James had just cleared for his own papers. "This is a durable power of attorney," Mark said, executed by Thomas Parker on March 3rd of last year, when he was of sound mind, evaluated and documented by his physician. He placed a fingertip on the notary seal, then on the signatures. "It designates Henry Parker and Rachel Parker as his agents for healthcare and financial decisions to act jointly. Which means no contracts, no sales, no transfers without them." Uncle Henry didn't look at James when he spoke. He watched Dad. "Tom, you remember when we went to Dr. Patel's office? We talked about paperwork so nobody could push you around. You signed this. With me there." Dad's eyes traveled to the page as if the letters might arrange themselves into something familiar if he stared long enough. He didn't speak, but his hand steadied. James's smile thinned. "Nice try. That's cute." He flicked a glance at Linda, then back to Mark. "These are old. And even if that's real, Dad can revoke it. Tonight." Only if he understands what he's revoking, Mark replied, still calm, and is making that decision free of undue influence. And only if proper procedure is followed. He shifted the top page just enough for the gold seal to catch the light. This was prepared with counsel, signed in front of witnesses and a notary public, with a physician's attestation of capacity. It's effective. It stands. The room reacted in ripples, chairs edge scooting, whispered reassurances, a neighbor's soft, "Oh, thank God," quickly swallowed. Karen's face went pale under her careful makeup. Linda's mouth tightened the way it did when she was about to pretend she was offended on principle. Enough theater. James snapped, turning pages as if pure speed could dislodge the law. Dad said the house is too much. That's all that matters. What matters, Mark said, is informed consent. Which brings us to something else. He reached into his bag again, this time for his laptop. He set it on the table where the cake had been and opened it. The screen's glow lit his face and the torn edges of place cards. He clicked a file. I knew what was coming. I had texted it to him this afternoon from the spare email account I'd created the day I found the swapped pills. The video opened on our kitchen. The camera angle was fixed, slightly high, as if the room were being watched by a patient ceiling. It had been. A small motion-activated camera tucked behind the ceramic canister labeled sugar, bought the week after Linda explained away her first generic switch. The timestamp in the corner read 6:42 p.m., 3 days earlier. On screen, Dad sat at the table in his cardigan, his hands wrapped around his mug the way he always did when the ceramic's warmth helped his fingers. Linda moved through the frame with a practiced ease, her smile visible even in profile. She placed a tin of tea on the counter, reached into her purse, and palmed something small and white. Not a tea bag. A tablet. You could see it even if you didn't want to. She glanced toward the hallway, the quick fox check that people do when they're alone with their choices. Then her hand tipped over the mug. The tablet hit the tea with a muted plink and a brief fizz that sent a pale swirl through the amber. She stirred twice slow. A neighbor put a hand to her mouth. Someone else whispered, "Oh my God." On the video, Linda turned, carrying the mug to my father with a softness any stranger would have mistaken for love. He smiled up at her, grateful. He sipped. 30 seconds later, his chin dipped. A minute after that, his elbow slid wider on the table. Linda placed a hand on his shoulder, then looked at her phone. The timestamp moved forward. At 6:47 p.m., his head nodded, heavy. She slipped the mug away. Mark paused the frame. In the frozen image, my father's mouth hung open slightly, the way it does when he falls asleep too fast. Linda's eyes were cast down, expression blank. Before anyone says this is nothing, Mark said, we had the residue in that cup tested. He tapped the keyboard. A scan of a one-page report appeared, the lab's header recognizable even to the local crowd. The concentration is consistent with a prescription-strength sedative not found in Mr. Parker's chart, administered in a dose that would strongly sedate an elderly patient. Linda found her voice first. This is outrageous. She laughed, a hard, brittle sound. You're spying on me in the kitchen? That's illegal. It's my kitchen, I said quietly. My father's kitchen. James pushed back his chair, the legs screeching against wood. We're not doing this. Turn it off. Mark didn't move. We will, as soon as everyone sees the time overlay. He dragged the cursor to the corner. The timestamp expanded, clear, and the date populated below it. This was recorded the evening before Mr. Parker had a very sleepy day, according to the text messages Ms. Linda sent to Rachel and to James. He tapped a second window, screenshots of Linda's messages stacked neatly, the one that read, "He's out like a light." Must be his age floating like a bad joke above the lab report. Uncle Henry's jaw worked once, a small clench, then released. He didn't speak. He kept his hand near Dad's on the table, a silent tether. Karen stepped back as if the screen had heat. I didn't know, she said, to no one and everyone. The guests were very still now. Even the violinist, case closed at his feet, stood with his head bent, as if listening for a note he hoped would change what he'd just seen. Linda reached for indignation like a coat she'd worn before. He couldn't sleep, she said too brightly. It was over the counter. I. Mark lifted a single palm, mild and implacable. Please don't say anything else. His gaze moved to James. And please don't touch those contracts again. They're not valid without the agent's signatures, and after what we've documented, any attempt to pressure Mr. Parker tonight would be unwise. James's eyes flicked to the laptop and back, still calculating, but the room had shifted its weight. The neighbors were no longer props, they were witnesses. The contracts between the casserole dishes looked suddenly ridiculous, flimsy compared to the stamped seals and the paused frame of a tablet dissolving into tea. I drew a breath that reached the bottom of my lungs for the first time all evening. The anniversary wine waited unopened. The turkey had cooled. My father looked at me, and in his eyes I saw exhaustion, yes, but also something like relief, like the blur had edges again. I closed Mark's portfolio over the power of attorney and slid it closer to Uncle Henry. Evidence lay on the table, paper, pixels, time, and for once, the weight of proof was not on my shoulders alone. Karen was the first to change shape. She picked up the top sheet of James's contracts and set it down like something hot. You knew, she said to him. You knew and you still. Stop being dramatic, he snapped. We're talking about real estate. Value. Dad can't manage a property like this. But he managed to raise us in it, I said, surprised at how even my voice sounded. Karen pressed her lips together, then turned to me with a look I had not seen on her face in years, apology, naked and simple. I'm sorry, she said, barely above a whisper. I believed him. Something in Linda cracked then, the poise, the rehearsed nurse's calm, the bright smile that could be pasted onto any scene. She lifted her glass, drained what was left, and set it down too hard. The clear rings stunned the room into stillness. All right, she said, words coming in a rush, breath hitching. Fine. Is this what you want? A confession. She gestured at the laptop, at the papers, at me. Yes. I married for the house. There. She laughed, harsh and near tears. You think I fell in love with this? She waved toward the curtains, the wainscoting, the farmhouse that held my mother's handwriting in its bones, this museum? I have been wasting my prime living in the countryside for the old man's sake. She spit the line as if someone else had put it in her mouth. James said there would be a sale, that I'd get half when we closed, that we'd all move on. That was the deal. A sound rippled through the room, shock, then anger, then a weary kind of recognition. Deals. Of course there was a deal. Linda, Karen said, horrified, you drugged him. I calmed him, Linda shot back. Do you know what it's like to listen to the same story every night about her turkey and their honeymoon wine and your mother loved this song? I was suffocating in other people's memories. Uncle Henry stood, his chair sliding back on the wood with a dry hush. He didn't raise his voice either. Our family never needed volume to cut. Then you could have left, he said. You don't keep a man by the throat and call it care. Linda's face twisted. Whether it was rage or shame or both, I couldn't tell. She snatched her clutch from the chair and looked at James for help. He didn't meet her eyes. That was the first honest thing he did all night. You promised me, she hissed at him. You promised me half. For a heartbeat, I thought he would deny it, spin, summon the old charm. He opened his mouth, closed it, glanced at the neighbors, at the lab report, at the power of attorney seal gleaming like a coin, and then did something I had never seen him do. Nothing. He said nothing. Linda threw her empty glass into the sink. It shattered against porcelain with a bright, brittle rain. Half the room flinched. I am done, she shouted toward no one and all of us. I am done living in this backwater for an old man who doesn't even know what day it is. She pivoted, heels scraping, and stalked down the hallway. The front door cracked wide, then slammed. Crickets took back the night. The silence she left behind was the heavy kind, the kind that settles when a mask has fallen, and you can see the face it hid. The neighbors shifted, lining their napkins, not sure if they should stay, not sure if leaving would mean abandoning us mid-surgery. The bottle of anniversary wine waited, its foil still perfect. Karen's shoulders dropped. She moved to Dad and knelt beside him. I'm so sorry, she said, her voice thick. He put his hand on her hair, the way he used to when she was small, and patted twice without quite knowing why he was doing it. James stood alone at the end of the table, contracting to the size of the man he really was. His eyes darted from face to face, looking for an ally, a loophole, a door that wasn't there. He glanced at Mark and found a wall. He glanced at Uncle Henry and found a brother's history that would not bend. He glanced at me and found the one person he had expected to crumble. James tried one more tactic, the last card in his deck. But I was protecting assets, he said, tone flat, as if he were in a conference room explaining a write-down. It's not personal. Everything in the room pushed back at once. A soft, collective exhale. It was personal, had been since the day he let me carry the weight and then called me a loser for it. Mark closed the laptop without drama. The image disappeared. The truth didn't. He slid it into his bag as if putting a lid on a pot that had already boiled over. Dr. Patel rested a hand on Dad's shoulder and took his pulse again, steadying both of them. Uncle Henry folded the power of attorney and put it safely back in its folder. Karen wiped at her cheeks and didn't bother pretending she wasn't crying. James wet his lips. He reached toward the stack of contracts as if touching paper could restore the plot, then let his hand fall. The neighbors watched him like you watch a storm decide whether to break the fence or move on. I stood very still. The truth is on the table, I said, more to myself than anyone else. No one contradicted me. And James didn't move. Outside, the porch light cut a pale path to the gravel, where the world waited for whatever would happen next. In the suspended second before the future, my brother stood alone, eyes darting like a trapped thing, and had nothing left to say. Within a week, the house went from a stage to a courthouse waiting room in miniature. Mark filed for an emergency protective order and a temporary injunction to block any sale or transfer. Dr. Patel submitted her notes. The lab submitted its report. The motion-activated video was logged and preserved. At the first hearing, the judge read the filings twice, then looked over her glasses at Linda and asked one question that landed like a gavel. Why is there a sedative in a cup of tea you served? Linda's answer was a shrug wrapped in excuses. The order was granted on the spot. Adult Protective Services opened a file the same day. A social worker came to the farmhouse, walked through our kitchen, and said gently, "You did the right thing." Copies of the appraiser's cards, the screenshots from Linda's messages with James, and the mislabeled pill bottles went into evidence bags. The house I had been accused of playing in now had a paper trail thick enough to make even James stop smiling. 2 weeks later, the county prosecutor's office opened a case. The charges they announced were quiet but heavy: suspected document forgery and drug substitution in the care of a dependent adult. Linda had tried to insist the labels were generic equivalents. The contracts were just drafts, the video taken out of context. The context was the point. The investigators didn't rush. They didn't need to. They had dates, doses, timestamps, and a witness list that began with our neighbors and ended with my uncle. By the end of the month, Linda was stripped of any rights over my father's person or property. Mark filed for an annulment on grounds of fraud and undue influence, and the judge granted it. The ring went into a drawer. Her perfume disappeared from the bathroom. When she came by once to collect clothes, she stood on the porch and looked out across the fields as if they owed her something. I didn't step aside. She left without a word. James's glossy confidence didn't hold up much longer. The bank where he worked heard whispers long before they received formal notices, and a compliance officer reached out to Mark for copies of anything relevant to fiduciary risk. That was the phrase, fiduciary risk. It sounded like numbers. It meant character. Separate investigators examined transfers out of Dad's checking account, reimbursements that never went to a pharmacy, a short-lived account in Linda's name that received consulting fees 3 days after the first appraisers appeared in our yard. He called me once, late, sounding small. I let it go to voicemail. Even when the bank placed him on leave, what hurt most wasn't the job. It was the silence from everyone who had been so eager to laugh at his jokes. He tried to show up at the house on a Sunday. Uncle Henry met him at the gate and kept his voice even. "Paper says you call before you come." James stared past him at the porch, at the chair where Dad used to smoke after dinner, at me standing just inside. He nodded, finally, like a man who had run out of doors to open. We didn't slam any behind him. We just learned to keep them locked. Karen came back slowly, then all at once. The night after the video, she cried at our kitchen table and said the sentence that sets bones. I believed the wrong person. She didn't try to wash it away with reasons. Instead, she showed up on Tuesdays with the kids and a casserole that was always slightly overbaked, as if she needed proof it had been made at home. She took Dad for walks around the yard. She sat with him on the porch while I ran to the store. When the kids argued over the swing, she corrected them softly, Grandpa first. She didn't ask to be trusted. She started behaving like someone who understood what trust cost. Dad's health improved in a way that felt like a room filling with air again. Without the sedatives seeping into his tea, his mornings belonged to him. Dr. Patel adjusted his prescriptions. We hired a physical therapist for twice-weekly visits, and he took pride in the little victories, standing without the arm of the chair, buttoning his flannel, teasing me for oversalting the soup. He began telling stories at his own pace instead of drifting mid-sentence into a chemically induced fog. Some days his memory still skipped like a record, but the needle found the groove more often. The house quieted. Night felt like rest, not like a cliff. Spring turned to summer. The garden came back. I pruned the roses my mother had planted, and Dad supervised from a lawn chair, offering comments that were mostly about 1983. On good afternoons, he would touch his wedding ring and tap the armrest twice, and I learned to read that as I'm still here. I started going into town for coffee with Karen once a week. We didn't talk much about James. Family sometimes means letting the truth sit between you without turning it into a chaos. In late August, on a day so blue it felt almost staged, I asked Dad if he wanted to go to New Mexico. He blinked at me, puzzled, then smiled like a boy. You know what's there, he said. Your mother's yes. When he proposed, he'd been 22, standing on a white hill in a wind that kept taking his words and tossing them back at his feet. She'd said yes anyway. He'd always promised to take her back every 10th anniversary. Life, money, and children had argued otherwise. We could argue back now. We drove instead of flying, because the car gives you time to tell the kinds of stories that don't fit into a direct route. In Kansas, we ate pie at a diner that still laminated the specials. In the Panhandle, he napped while I drove and listened to his favorite station of crackly baseball. In Santa Fe, I bought him a hat he didn't need and turquoise earrings for myself because I wanted something bright that had nothing to do with court dates. We reached White Sands in the soft hour before sunset, when the dunes go pale gold and the shadows etch their own quiet. Dad took my elbow, more out of habit than necessity, and we walked a little way, the sand squeaking under our shoes. He stopped and looked out over the ripples. Right there, he said, pointing. I dropped the ring and your mother laughed so hard I thought she'd say no just to teach me a lesson. I could almost hear her. The wind made the same dry music it must have made then. He took off his hat and held it to his chest. On the drive back to the motel, he fell asleep with the map across his lap, smiling. I drove behind a string of red taillights and thought about how narrow the gap had been between losing everything that made us a family and learning how to carry it better. Mark had given us law, Uncle Henry had given us presents, Dr. Patel had given us science, Karen had given us a second chance. Back home, the farmhouse looked the way it always had, stubborn, a little chipped, full of ordinary light. The case against Linda moved forward at the pace of legal calendars. The investigation into James kept widening, new forms, old transfers, the brittle paper trail of someone who always thought he could talk faster than the facts. We didn't wait on outcomes to start living. We set alarms, we filled pillboxes, we wrote down the jokes Dad still liked to tell. I stopped expecting a cinematic apology from anyone. I just watered the garden and let the quiet be a teacher. Sometimes the deepest cuts come from the hands that once tucked you in. I learned that the hard way. Not from strangers, not from headlines, but right at my father's table, under the soft light of our dining room, with the smell of turkey and old photo paper in the air. I used to think love meant endurance, quietly swallowing the insults, doing the work no one sees, telling yourself that sacrifice would eventually be recognized. It won't. Love without boundaries is a hallway with no doors. What saved us wasn't a miracle. It was a phone call made with shaking hands and a spine I finally decided to use. One number. One friend who knew the law. One uncle who showed up. One doctor who told the truth. Sometimes that's all it takes for the floor to stop tilting and the room to stand still long enough for the facts to land. Tell me what you would do in my place. Would you forgive my brother? Would you even try? Write your answer in the comments below. I genuinely want to hear your own stories. If this hit close to home, subscribe to my channel and tap like so the algorithm carries this to someone who needs it tonight. Sometimes the people closest to us betray us more than strangers.